Hello, I'm Jeff Thielman, the President and CEO of the International Institute of New England. Welcome to our Town Hall webinar From Victim to Survivor, Supporting Immigrants Freed from Human Trafficking. Human trafficking is a crime that affects millions nationally, and immigrants are especially vulnerable. During our webinar this afternoon, our staff will unpack what trafficking is and why traffickers often target immigrants, how survivors escape human trafficking, how IINE supports immigrant survivors of trafficking through the federal program TVAP, which stands for Trafficking Victims Assistance Program, how TVAP functions and its impact at a national level. We will be sharing a recording of today's webinar along with the PowerPoint slides by email later this week. Our mission statement at the International Institute of New England is to create opportunities for refugees and immigrants to succeed through resettlement, education, career advancement, and pathways to citizenship. This is work we have done for over 100 years, since a group of compassionate and brave women at a YWCA in Lowell opened our first office. Throughout our history, spanning a century, we have navigated multiple periods of national anti-immigrant sentiment and legislation, just as we are doing today. In these moments, we pivot to more deeply support the refugees and immigrants who are already in our communities to help them grow their English skills, find jobs, and enter the community safely and peacefully. We are committed to being fierce advocates for the more than 10,000 individuals currently in our care throughout New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and in the New York City metro area where we support unaccompanied children. Thankfully, we have never done this work alone. We are fortunate to partner with schools, healthcare organizations, employers, fellow nonprofits, and supporters and volunteers like you who make this work possible. Our theory of change is designed to provide persecuted and displaced individuals with the support they need to start strong in our communities, and with time, give back to their new home. We welcome refugees and immigrants, help them stabilize through English classes and employment support, and support their longer-term integration through civic engagement and legal services. Clients can enter and re-enter IINE's continuum of care at various points in their journeys in the United States. Our goal is to help each person and family become self-sufficient as quickly as possible because there is no strong safety net in the United States. We see time and again that this initial investment in refugees and immigrants is more than paid back. Refugees and immigrants pay billions in taxes, fill critical workforce jobs, and are key to future economic growth. During our webinar today, you will hear from my colleagues, Senior Vice President and Chief Advancement Officer Alexandra Zan-Weber, and TVAP Lead Case Specialist Andrew Vansilidis, and from Bart Backman, the Associate Director of Trafficking Services at the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. Zan will provide an overview of why human traffickers often target immigrants, how victims are able to escape trafficking, and how the International Institute of New England helps shape the Federal Trafficking Victim Assistance Program when it was first created more than 15 years ago. Andrew will then join us to share more about the services IINE provides to survivors and the challenges survivors face in rebuilding their lives in this country. Bart will then provide an overview of human trafficking at the national level, including how different organizations work to prevent trafficking and support survivors, and the most common countries of origin and labor industries of survivors. Please use the Q&A feature to submit any questions throughout the program. Zan, Andrew, and Bart will be available to answer them following the presentation. Now I want to turn over to my colleague, Zan Weber, our Senior Vice President and Chief Advancement Officer.
Thank you, Jeff. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. So as Jeff said, I'd like to start the overview by taking a step back and defining human trafficking. Human trafficking is a crime that involves exploitation of a person for labor, services, or commercial sex. Unfortunately, trafficking in persons is shockingly common in our country and in the world. More than 27.6 million adults and children become victims each year worldwide. One other important note around definitions, human trafficking is different from smuggling, which often people confuse. Smuggling is the movement of people, whereas human trafficking involves acts, means, and purpose. Acts is when a trafficker recruits, transports, or obtains a person for services. Means is how a trafficker uses force, fraud, or coercion, such as physical harm, reputational harm, threats to others, or debt manipulation to make the victim perform the services. And then purpose is the trafficker's goal. So for example, human trafficking could be using a person's lack of legal status to force them into providing labor services or sexual services against their will by promising benefits and protections that never come. So we have a quick quiz to underscore the common forms of human trafficking, and a question will pop up on the screen momentarily. And if you would take a few minutes and just respond. And the question is, what is the most common form of human trafficking experienced by foreign nationals in the US? Sex trafficking, labor trafficking, or third option, sex trafficking and labor trafficking are equally common. And we'll just give you a few moments to respond. So if you answered labor trafficking, you are correct. For foreign national survivors of human trafficking, labor trafficking is significantly more common. In fact, in 2023, of the foreign national survivors served by the US government, 64% were victims of labor trafficking. 18% were victims of sex trafficking, 13 were victims of both forms of trafficking, and 5% of that total were victims of trafficking whose form of trafficking wasn't identified. So next, our presentation today is focused very specifically on foreign-born survivors of human trafficking. Refugees and immigrants are prime targets of traffickers for a few different reasons. Number one, people who are forcibly displaced have often experienced trauma from displacement due to catastrophes like violence, natural disasters in their home countries, famine, or disease. This leaves them often in desperate circumstances. Number two, many refugees and immigrants may be isolated from their family and their friends. Number three, many immigrants experience language barriers, which further isolates them and can impact their ability to navigate their life in the US and impede their ability to secure a stable job, making them extra vulnerable to coercive labor opportunities. And then number four, immigrants exploited by human traffickers may be awaiting legal status in the US and thus reluctant to engage local law enforcement to report their experiences or seek help. Despite all of these challenges, luckily, fortunately, however, thousands of survivors do escape trafficking situations every year, and many of them with the support of international organizations, domestic nonprofits, and local law enforcement agencies. In the past, IINE has played a role in working with attorneys and law enforcement and helping identify human trafficking survivors escaping trafficking. Today, our work shifted to survivor support. When a person who's a foreign-born national exits a human trafficking situation in the Boston area today, they're referred to us, they're referred to IINE, and we offer them support through the Federal Trafficking Victim Assistance Program, otherwise known as TVAP. TVAP is a federal program that was created as a result of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, which granted law enforcement agencies powers to pursue human traffickers. The program offers survivors a unique visa called a T non-immigrant visa, as well as other legal protections because of their experiences. And funding through the program allows our organization to provide support services to help victims and their children stabilize, to help them recover from experiences, help them gain legal status, and integrate into their communities safely. So to go a little bit deeper into the history and the context of these protections, as I mentioned before the Human Trafficking Victim Assistance Program was well defined, the International Institute of New England helped pull together local task forces consisting of law enforcement agencies, NGOs, and legal providers to better coordinate some of our services. At that time, the process was very focused on how survivors could assist in prosecuting traffickers. And understandably, many survivors wanted nothing to do with the prosecution process because of its proximity to their traffickers and the trauma that they endured at their traffickers' hands. So fortunately, over time, we and other organizations and partners on the task forces helped shift survivor support away from prosecution and toward addressing a survivor's needs and their recovery. We were able to secure a federal contract, in fact, that allowed us to more flexibly offer client-centered case management, and we formed strong partnerships with other like-minded organizations doing this work. Through those efforts, altogether, we helped design a new program that informed what would become the national TVAP model, which is very client-centered. So now I'd like to welcome Andrew to our conversation to share some more details about our services to foreign national trafficking survivors.
Thank you so much, Zan. And good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Vonzalidis, and I am the lead TVAP case specialist here at the International Institute of New England. I want to thank everyone for coming here today and taking a little bit of time out of your day to learn a little bit more about the clients that we help serve. So first off, I want to tell you a little bit more about the specifics of those clients that we served in the last year. Most of the clients that we have are referred to the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants by lawyers with a background in screening for human trafficking. After USCRI reviews the referral and sees if it's a good fit for IINE's TVAP program, that referral will then be sent to us. So here's the breakdown of who we served last year. Last year, in 2024, IINE served 50 TVAP clients. The breakdown by age group was 84% of them were adults and 16% were minors. Gender, it was 62% of them were female and 38% were male. And then finally, the breakdown of labor versus sex trafficking. About 76% of those cases were labor trafficking cases, 12% were sex trafficking cases, and 12% contained aspects of both. And that last statistic is not incredibly different from some of the national statistics on immigrant trafficking victims. So TVAP provides an array of different services that help to stabilize and then uplift victims of human trafficking. For those who are referred to us by an organization but don't yet have their own attorney, our TVAP program works to get them connected with legal assistance. Most immigrants who leave active trafficking can't receive the benefits that other clients receive. The wait for a T visa right now is nearly 2 years after submission, so getting them connected with a lawyer is very, very important. So this 2-year wait, when many of our clients can't support themselves through work, is a difficult period. Our focus during this time is providing the case management and the legal support needed to help them stabilize and recover, and then eventually begin to rebuild their lives and reach a certain self-sufficiency. While our clients are working towards this goal, we provide support to ensure that they have access to basic necessities such as food and clothing. And then finally, beyond legal help and case management, there are other areas where we work to promote the success of our clients. Any person we serve who can attend English classes is referred, which is a very important step to their long-term success in the United States. For those that become eligible when they get a T visa, we will help them access public benefits while they look for a full-time job to become self-sufficient and contribute to themselves, their families, and our communities here in New England. There's still a lot of need, so we try and meet this final need with resources that are generously provided by IINE's donation network. But as you might be aware of, our TVAP clients also face many, many obstacles after exiting a trafficking situation. While adults are referred by their lawyers, many of the minors that we work with are often referred as unaccompanied children and need help getting legal assistance. Additionally, after exiting a traumatic situation like trafficking, many people have mental and physical health issues that can go unaddressed. This is due to the fact that until they get a T visa, trafficking victims have a lack of significant income and access to healthcare. Clients who have long-term physical disabilities due to their trafficking will often have difficulty getting these problems addressed. The same will go for their mental health care and therapy. And as discussed earlier, before obtaining a T visa, immigrant survivors of trafficking will experience financial instability, which makes life navigating post-trafficking very difficult. These barriers also affect their access to housing, as many survivors, as I mentioned earlier, do not have the income necessary to support themselves in private housing. Many of these clients move from shelter to shelter until their T visa is approved. And then finally, our clients face language barriers, whether it's calling for services on phone lines that are English only, asking for directions in public, or communicating with some public officials. This can also limit them as well. So I've given you a lot of, more general and abstract things about what TVAP is, but I really want to show what it means on a personal level for one of our clients that I had the privilege of working with. So this is a story of a young woman from the Dominican Republic who I worked with. She was connected with TVAP in spring of 2022 and had just escaped trafficking and was living in, emergency housing in a hotel room with her young children. Her T visa application had just recently been submitted. She was then enrolled in TVAP and provided housing support in May and June. She started receiving case management from us and legal assistance. She was referred to English classes and was so determined that she was given a laptop and was taking classes from the shelter that she was in, and continued doing this despite the fact that she was moving from shelter to shelter to shelter due to the stay limitations at different shelters in Massachusetts. By late spring 2023, after really over a year of working with us, this woman learned that her T visa had been approved. By the summer, she received her documents and was connected with an employment case manager here at IINE, as well as other skills training workshops. She was also connected to benefits like SNAP and TAFDC to help her while she searched for work. She found work by the early fall. At this point, had conversational English and was able to get her own car, which helped her navigate and not just solely rely on public transportation. And by spring of 2024, when I checked in with her again, she now had her own apartment that she was paying rent for, spoke English very conversationally after attending our classes with so much dedication. She had a job and a legal status that included a pathway to a green card. So that is the story of one of our clients. To give you an idea more of what things look like on the national level, I would like to invite Bart Bachman to join.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you so much for sharing that story of one of the participants in our program. I think it's always so great to see people receive the help that partners like IINE are able to offer, and then move on from there to really great, fulfilling lives. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. As Jeff mentioned earlier, my name is Bart Bachman, and I am the Associate Director of Trafficking Services at the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants, or USCRI. We are another piece of the anti-trafficking services framework, and I was lucky enough to be invited by the International Institute of New England today to discuss how we partner with them on the national level to implement the Trafficking Victim Assistance Program, or TVAP. But first, let me tell you a little bit more about the organization I work for. We are the U.S. Committee for Refugees and Immigrants. We are a nonprofit organization headquartered in the Washington, D.C. area, and our mission is to protect the rights and address the needs of persons in forced or voluntary migration worldwide by advancing fair and humane public policy, facilitating and providing direct professional services, and promoting the full participation of migrants in community life. As part of this mission, we have a really wide array of programs at USCRI that includes refugee resettlement and refugee integration services, a legal services department, a shelter for unaccompanied children, and the anti-trafficking services department, which was where I am lucky enough to be based and oversee. While USCRI is headquartered in the Washington, D.C. area, we have field offices and partner agencies across the country where we're helping serve the refugees and immigrants, one of which, as I mentioned, is the International Institute of New England in Boston and the Massachusetts area. And bringing us to our topic today, for anti-trafficking services specifically, we've kind of always served trafficking victims through a variety of our programs, but we really started centering in on this work in 2012, which is when we first began administering the Trafficking Victim Assistance Program. In 2018, USCRI became the sole national grantee of TVAP, meaning that we were the one recipient of the grant, implementing it nationwide before we were one of a few different grantees. And in 2022, we received the grant to administer the Aspire Child Trafficking Victim Assistance Program, which is a new grant that was actually kind of spun out of TVAP to focus specifically on foreign national minors and their specific needs. As Andrew mentioned, a lot of the clients we see are unaccompanied children or other minors, and we really wanted to make sure we were crafting a specific child-friendly service for them. So, as mentioned, as of 2022, there are two large national programs that USCRI implements focused on services for foreign national survivors of trafficking. That is TVAP, or the Trafficking Victim Assistance Program, which serves adult foreign national survivors of trafficking, and the Aspire program for foreign national minor survivors of trafficking. Let's zoom out a little bit from there, though, to look at kind of the full national federal framework. I think obviously if you're on this call today, and a lot of people have seen kind of in the news, in the media, at a national level, a lot of people today really are aware of human trafficking as a concept, as a crime. But if we look at it kind of in history, it's actually quite recently that the anti-trafficking movement in the US actually enacted legislation to center human trafficking as a crime in its own right. It used to be linked to maybe commercial sex or linked to labor violations or to physical abuse, but human trafficking as itself was really centered in the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. It's since been amended and reauthorized, but really the basis of TVAP and Aspire and this wider federal effort against trafficking is that TVPA of 2000. So right now in the 25th anniversary of that work. The TVPA created services and support for survivors regardless of immigration status. That includes the Trafficking Victim Assistance Program, of course, because we serve foreign nationals, but then it also created the T visa to protect victims of trafficking from removal. The T visa is a really important form of immigration relief that can help trafficking victims who might have lost their status due to their trafficking experience or generally in the US on account of their trafficking to regularize their status and eventually move towards a green card and citizenship. The TVPA also established the 3P framework for trafficking, which is protection, prevention, and prosecution. And what we see today is that this framework continues to be implemented across many different federal agencies, including the U.S. Department of Justice, the Department of Health and Human Services, the Department of State, Department of Homeland Security, Justice. It really is such a kind of complex crime that can reach so many different kind of areas that it really takes this multifaceted, multi-stakeholder approach to tackle. So where do we kind of sit within that federal framework? TVAP itself is funded by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Children and Families, Office on Trafficking in Persons, known as OTIP. I know that's a lot of different administrations, offices, but we fall under Health and Human Services. And part of that OTIP, Office on Trafficking in Persons mission, is to prevent trafficking and protect survivors of trafficking. So again, they have those kind of 2 Ps of the 3 P framework. We leave the prosecution to the Department of Justice, as it should be, leave it to the lawyers. But OTIP really focuses on rebuilding the lives and strengthening the health and well-being of survivors. And one thing I really like about being able to work closely with Health and Human Services is they really do take kind of a more public health approach towards preventing trafficking and assisting those survivors and kind of working towards a country where we are preventing trafficking from happening and creating a holistic response for those who do fall victim to trafficking. So, as mentioned, USCRI works very closely with OTIP to implement the Trafficking Victim Assistance Program and the Aspire Child Trafficking Victim Assistance Program. Kind of generally how we sit is OTIP within Health and Human Services and the government creates the high-level anti-trafficking strategies and policies at the federal level. They're often the one that they fund us, but they also fund other programs to prevent trafficking and to respond to different aspects of trafficking, such as the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And they do a lot of that coordination with the other agencies, with Department of Justice, with Department of Homeland Security, to make sure that they're on top of all of the trends, making sure that we're tackling trafficking that we see on the ground, and there's a coordinated national response with those priorities being tackled. OTIP, of course, also issues grants to fund programs such as TVAP and Aspire, and that is where I and my program team get to come in that USCRI is the current cooperative agreement holder for the TVAP and Aspire grants. So we receive the grant from Health and Human Services, and then we administer the TVAP and Aspire programs across USCRI sites, USCRI field offices, and partner agency sites. And as part of that administrative work, we also provide training and technical assistance, both to our partners, but also really to anyone who works in the space with foreign national survivors of trafficking. We conduct oversight and monitoring to make sure that all of the services that we fund for this population meet our standards for trauma-informed care. And we collect data that we, of course, then report back up to OTIP to help guide the national anti-trafficking efforts. And on that note of data, I wanted to kind of show a little bit of what we're seeing nationally that you'll see is very much in line with what Andrew and Zan and everyone described here on the ground in Boston and Massachusetts. But across the country, we served 2,104 survivors last federal fiscal year 2024. That includes kind of breaking down between the two programs. We served 541 minor participants through the Aspire Child Trafficking Victim Assistance Program and 1,591 adults through TVAP. If you're doing the math on that really quickly, I'm not wrong, but if you're really good at the mental math, it doesn't quite add up because there are clients who within the fiscal year receive both services as a minor and an adult, so some are double counted, but that does get us up to the 2,104 survivors total. And I think one thing that you might not be able to gather right away from looking at this, but I'm happy to share is that I started this work in 2017, and I think when I started, we were serving less than 50 minors a year. Now that has grown 10 times to the 541 participants that were served through Aspire last year. I think I've seen a really huge effort to better identify minor survivors of trafficking and make sure that they're getting the services that they need, because they are such a particularly vulnerable population. And part of that was spinning out Aspire to be its own program to make sure that it's really targeting and specific for assistance for that population. For type of trafficking, again, we see that this is pretty in line with what the International Institute of New England presented. We have around 2/3 of the survivors we serve experience labor trafficking, 16% experience sex trafficking, 14% experience both. We do see a lot of clients whose experience kind of includes both sex and labor trafficking elements, and 5% of the trafficking experience was not reported to us. For the top countries of origin nationally, we see the top 5 countries of origin for the survivors we serve last year were Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and the Philippines. Again, having been in this work for a little bit now, I would say that those 5 countries are generally pretty relatively stable as the largest nationalities that we've served through TVAP over the years. But we do kind of lower down on that list, especially see a good amount of changes based on geopolitics or kind of other trends we see. For example, in the 6th spot last year was Venezuela, which we've seen a large increase in Venezuelan survivors identified due to the instability in Venezuela right now and the subsequent outmigration to the US. Overall, though, I do always like to stress that survivors do come from all over, though. There's no profile of this kind of quote unquote standard survivor. We served survivors from 85 different countries last fiscal year through TVAP and Aspire. As I mentioned earlier, 2/3 of our survivors do experience labor trafficking, and one thing we ask our providers to report to us is what industries they experience their exploitation and trafficking in. So last year, we saw that the top industries were domestic work or domestic servitude, agriculture and field labor, construction, and restaurant food service work. And you can see here that, again, trafficking can happen across so many different types of industries. But one thing that I really like to kind of highlight, especially in those top 4, is that you can really see the wide spectrum of where trafficking is occurring. It can definitely happen in industries that might be more away from the public eye. We can see a lot of trafficking for a domestic servant who's doing childcare, who's doing cleaning within a home for a family without much kind of exposure to the outside world. It can happen in a rural area, on a farm, away from a major city, away from other kind of forms of support. But it can also be happening right in front of you. It can be happening in a restaurant. It can be happening on a construction site you pass by on the way to work. That we really do kind of see it happening all over the country and in a wide variety of sectors and industries. And that's why we like to say it's really important to make sure that you are aware of trafficking, that we're making sure that all of workers know their rights, and that they know what their rights are as a worker, so that they are able to better identify when they are at risk of labor exploitation or labor trafficking, and we kind of as a larger community can work together to prevent it from happening.
Bart, thank you so much. I think you're right that the landscape is really complex, and I think what I take away from your details as well as Andrew's is that it takes a whole community of providers and support and funding to both prevent trafficking, respond to its complexity, but then also really take care of the people that experience it and are impacted by it. And with that, I'm really glad we got a chance to hear more about the federal framework. I do think this country has done a lot of work to implement a significant infrastructure to respond to trafficking. And I think that's something we could be really proud of. I'd love to invite Andrew back. And at this point, we're going to open up for questions from our audience. And just a reminder to put any of your questions into the Q&A feature. Okay, and we are going to start with a few questions. So the first is, and maybe Andrew, you could take this, Bart, you can weigh in if you want. How does supporting minors differ than supporting adult survivors?
Sure. I would say that one of the most crucial things when you're talking about a minor who's experienced some form of trafficking is that this is something extremely traumatic that's occurred at like a key developmental stage in someone's life. So I think sometimes this can have a really profound effect on a lot of the kids that we're serving. And that can impact anything from ways that they communicate to actions that if you're not necessarily approaching it in a way that is understanding and informed about the type of trauma they might have experienced on their way and inside of the US, there may be actions or ways that the child that you're working with acts that may not necessarily compute with what you're expecting as a case manager. I'd also say that a lot of the minors that we work with are referred to us as unaccompanied children. So, one thing that is really big for a lot of those minors is they're navigating the United States often without, the presence of a lot of family members that would often provide a lot of support and growth for someone at, again, a really important time in their lives. So we often are trying to help them navigate so many different types of social services, whether it's, the school system here in the United States, whether it's other basic services. And then finally, many of the children that are referred in TVEP have to be referred to a lawyer. So these were all things that I've done in particular, with minor clients, but I'd say those are some of the main differences that I've seen.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, and maybe for Bart, how do trafficking survivors typically come into contact with their exploiters?
Yeah, I think I would say that again, just as there's no kind of quote unquote standard profile of a trafficking victim, there's also no standard profile of the trafficker or exploiter themselves. So we see a really wide array. We see some traffickers are the recruiter in our survivors' home countries who offered them the jobs maybe in the Philippines or elsewhere and kind of offered them the job to come to the US. That could be the trafficker or the employer related to that opportunity. We do see some gang related trafficking across the US, but then we also see a lot of trafficking from a family member, from a parent, from an aunt or uncle that someone came to the US to stay with, from a family friend, or again, the kind of like owner of a small restaurant or the owner of a small hotel who is exploiting their labor for sex trafficking, but also labor trafficking. We often see someone's intimate partner, potentially, an American citizen, or not. That intimate partner is the one who is kind of using some sort of leverage over them to exploit them for either commercial sex or labor. So again, I would say that there is kind of no, there definitely are some things that we've seen growth in. We've definitely seen a kind of increase of traffickers utilizing social media to target, especially children, but also adults. But it really can be kind of any way you could meet someone could be the way that someone comes into contact with someone who's looking to take advantage, exploit, and traffic them.
Yeah, that's horrifying. Andrew, because we as an organization and USCRI as well, but definitely the Institute, in providing direct services, work with so many different survivors of persecution, of trafficking, of other forms of abuse, of violence. Are there experiences and challenges of our TVAP clients that are really different from the other types of immigrants and the experiences that they have.
Yeah, absolutely, Zen. There certainly are. I would say that, for instance, a lot of our clients that come through as refugees through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, there's a little bit more of a formalized process for them. So, they might arrive in the U.S. and then have certain expectations that, once you arrive, these services are going to be provided to you, and then there will be like a 90-day follow-up, and there are certain boxes that you're checking off at certain time periods. Whereas I would say we are referred a lot of our T visa clients at very different points after they have exited trafficking. So what someone is experiencing immediately after exiting a trafficking situation versus someone who is much further along the line after that happening are going to be, in many cases, very different needs. And we always try to adapt to whatever the client is facing, and focus our services in the way that's going to best help them based on what they're currently experiencing.
On that note, maybe for both of you, do we see a majority of people who are really fresh out of trafficking experiences or further along in recovery?
I would say it really varies. I mean, at a national level, we have served people that our partners have been the ones on the ground with law enforcement, or who the survivor showed up at a shelter and was like, I just left this situation, I need help. We've been there in that situation. We've also been there in a situation where, maybe they've been out of the situation for a year or two, or something else happening, and then all of a sudden they finally, through talking to someone, and maybe it's their lawyer, maybe it's another social service provider, all of a sudden they are able to disclose to someone that, oh, I experienced this in the past. Often they might not know that it is human trafficking. They just know it as something horrible they experienced, or some kind of, horrible work situation, but they are able to eventually disclose that and identify it as trafficking. But yeah, again, I would defer to Andrew too, but we really do see people. It could be day 0 or day 1 from leaving this situation, or much further on.
This may not be a question you know the answer to, either of you, but you've talked a lot about the protections of this program, in particular the T visa. Is there a sense of that protection and the opportunity for T visas being at risk under this new administration?
Um, I think obviously I'm not very privy to what the administration is thinking on this. I would say I hope not. I think that kind of throughout the years, there definitely have been some kind of rumors that people in this space have heard, that there have been some kind of advocates, some kind of groups arguing that the T visa should be eliminated. I think that as of right now, we've seen nothing official to that extent. And I obviously would say that the T visa is so important and has support from a lot of different people kind of across the spectrum, because it is, as going back to that kind of framework. I know, Zan, you talked about how before we used to be so focused on prosecution, and now we kind of move towards this focus on survivors. But what I hear from all of our partners in law enforcement, at Department of Justice, etc., is that like those really go hand in hand, and that to prosecute the traffickers, if there's going to be any hope of kind of having the survivor help that process along, they're also going to want an advocate or a case manager like Andrew and the team at International Institute of New England, kind of offering that human touch, that support, that emotional support along the way. So I think that we say that all of those really is so important, that those all go together. And luckily, I think that there is still pretty strong support to go after human trafficking. And I just hope that we can continue that for many, many years to come. Because as you've said, we've made so much progress in 25 years. It's kind of crazy to think that the TVPA is just 25 years old. I hope we can really continue that kind of immense growth in our fight against trafficking over the next 25.
Yeah, I mean, it's the opportunity for protection at that level seems so important for victims and their capacity to heal and come forward and support those those prosecutions. We have another question in terms of all that we've talked about around trauma and recovery. What do we offer in terms of mental health services to survivors?
Sure. I can take that one. So yeah, as you know, we've talked about a lot of how the different clients that we serve face a lot of different mental health issues. So one of the things that I try and do as a case manager is especially I try and make sure that the people I'm working with know that we do have connections to certain mental health providers. There's one that I really use from Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center. That is, and I'm not sure if the name's coming to my head, but it's the Immigrants and Refugee something support center. I wouldn't quote me on that, but I do a lot of referrals to them, especially for clients who are presenting mental health issues that are really impeding sometimes their ability to continue moving forward after such a traumatic event. But I also try and just, gauge what the clients and what the person's openness to mental health services is as well, and make sure that we're not forcing it on them, of course. But yeah, overall, we do try and refer to people who are licensed medical professionals and can work on addressing a lot of the mental health issues and trauma our clients have experienced. And for me, a really helpful contact has been Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center.
That's great to hear. I think Boston and Massachusetts more broadly benefits from a very robust healthcare program, and I'm happy to hear there's specialists in certain types of trauma that are helping support us. We have lots of really great questions, so a couple of more. This one's sort of more technical. How does a person's TVAP status impact his or her immigration status? And does one's TVAP status help or hurt immigration status?
I would say that those are pretty kind of separate processes. The TVAP and Aspire process is really kind of meant to be a support for someone who has received or is working towards their T visa status. So usually, we have that all goes through a different government agency, the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. We have kind of no say in whether whether or not someone who is identified as a survivor ends up receiving the T visa or not. But obviously we kind of I would say, as opposed to cause and effect, we're kind of just alongside each other, that we are one of the supports, as Andrew mentioned, we're one of the supports that can be offered to someone who might not be eligible or might not have a kind of stable form of income until they receive their T visa.
Okay, another somewhat technical or detailed question. How do you navigate challenges around digital literacy with adults? I've noticed post-pandemic, our world is so virtual, and sometimes it can be a struggle to assist survivors or get them connected when things are virtually based.
Sure. Actually, one thing that we have really been focusing on in both late last year and definitely this year has been digital literacy for a lot of our clients. We've been very fortunate that IINE has allowed us to take on an intern for the TVAP program. So actually, as we speak right now, our intern is working with one of our clients on a digital literacy project. So I think that is such a great question, because ability to navigate technical issues is just one of the biggest barriers that I see a lot of our clients encounter, because usually when they're trying to either communicate with their lawyer or another organization, sometimes they may not know necessarily how to use email or how to use GPS systems. And we think about it in many cases growing up in the United States like it's second nature, but this can really limit a lot of people who that wasn't their experience. And so we have really at this point, weekly workshops with different clients of ours, with this intern that we've been working with to help both, promote and increase a lot of our clients' ability to work with technology so that it doesn't limit them in the future.
That's so interesting. And it feels like it's honestly somewhat connected to recovery, just in terms of like regaining control, learning how to navigate, sort of empowering someone to be able to support themselves, find, their way. Obviously the internet is so powerful as a tool. So just an interesting way to think about empowerment coming out of that experience. I have a sort of a broader, basic, but really important question. What are some of the signs someone is being humanly trafficked?
Yeah, I think it can really vary. I mean, I think that, if you want to do more after leaving this presentation, there's lots of great trainings on red flags for trafficking kind of indicators. I think obviously it depends. The indicators of labor and sex trafficking can be a little different, and that is probably a whole other hour-long training by itself. But some signs that we often see are a big one, especially among immigrant survivors, is having kind of someone else controlling their passport or immigration documents, or someone saying that their employer or someone else is threatening them with deportation. Sometimes even if they have legal status but don't understand, so we see is, oh well, my boss told me that unless I worked for no pay, he would call immigration authorities and get me deported, kind of something like that. I think that is often those threats of deportation or threats of law enforcement can be something that is a sign of trafficking. Um, Another one, obviously, because kind of nature, someone indicating that they're working really long hours without pay, or just that they have a very large debt, and no matter what they do, they're not able to pay off the debt. One thing we've seen, especially for the children, is reports of kids falling asleep in school because they've been working all night, because they feel they're being forced to work. Um, there's so many. I think for sex trafficking specifically, some of the kind of classic indicators, for minors, but maybe for adults also, is having more than one phone, having, for a minor, an age inappropriate partner, a sudden influx of wealth or new clothes or hypersexualized behavior that can't be explained. So I think that that's kind of like touching the surface. Obviously some people also work in dangerous industries, so injuries, extreme tiredness, that can be a sign of trafficking. But I would say really kind of often it's going to be hard walking down the street to like identify someone, be like, that looks like a victim of trafficking. But what we hear often more is, as mentioned, one of the top industries is domestic servants. So maybe someone in childcare or working within a home. And what we hear is that maybe their one time they're allowed to leave the house is to take the kids they watch to the park. And then talking to someone at the park, they start talking like, oh, like my boss is holding my passport and won't let me have it. Or, they for the last 5 months, they've told me that actually I owe them money for breaking something and they're not giving me that money. Or they just haven't paid me for 5 months at all. Or what do you mean it's strange to be working 18 hours a day? So I think that kind of like community connection is really where we see a lot of that, like kind of that cross, both that education to people about what their rights are in the US, and also sharing to someone like, oh, someone kind of saying, oh, that doesn't sound right to me. And that's where we kind of find then that connection to services.
Thank you. That's really, really detailed. And we're going to have a slide in a moment that helps people understand what to do if they have any suspicions someone's been trafficked. But like, I'll use this as the last question before we wrap up. But on that note of, it really feels like traffickers go to great lengths to hide trafficking and exploitive situations. And on that note, what is being done to prevent human trafficking?
I feel like that's such a good kind of $1 million question to end on, because as I mentioned earlier, we always say that the three P's are protection, prosecution, and prevention. And I feel like our sense in a lot of our spaces is that we've made a lot of progress on protection once someone's identified as a victim and on prosecution. But the prevention is the one that's so intangible and kind of hard to touch, or hard to really pinpoint, because what we often see are the biggest vulnerabilities are economic insecurity, housing instability, lack of social connection, these like huge societal issues, societal barriers. I think just like the way rent has increased, and like corresponding housing instability has been really difficult for a lot of people in cities that can lead to potential trafficking, but it's such a huge issue to tackle. But I think I would say there are some really kind of interesting initiatives funded by HHS and others, looking around like how to educate kids in school on trafficking in a way that isn't overly scary and is age appropriate, but introduces them to topics such as, what rights do you have? What is trafficking? How to report it to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. Internet safety is such a big one, as mentioned, because we see so many people using that social media aspect to target people. And again, just that kind of, I think it's that kind of like community connection, peer-to-peer mentoring, making sure that people understand their rights in the workplace and understand that there kind of just is help available if they're in a situation that counts as trafficking.
Great. Well, thank you. I would just add, like, I've been in this work and in the earliest parts of trying to respond to victims and survivors for almost 17 years now. And so many more people, I think you said this at the beginning, where know what human trafficking is. And there's just such a more comprehensive response to all parts of it. And I'm just so impressed with both the reach USARI has achieved in really responding, like stepping up and responding to the challenge, as well as, like Andrew, like the care that you take when it actually comes to individuals who have experienced something so traumatic and such a violation in so many ways. So thank you both so much. I've learned a lot. We're just gonna wrap up with a couple of notes about how people can get involved. And then Jeff is gonna close us out, but I really wanted to thank you.
Thank you.
So just briefly, we've come to the end of the presentation, but as always, we just want to remind everyone who's joined us that there are definitely ways you can support refugee and immigrant communities. We actually need more support than ever to ensure that our survivors and our programs can recover, can rebuild their lives. We rely on community support, not only to understand problems like these, but also understand how we're addressing them and just support us in addressing the challenges and the needs of survivors. So a couple of different ways you can help is, number one, we just talked about learning the signs of trafficking. And Bart did an excellent job, I think, really detailing some of those signs. There's a lot more information. And then there is a hotline that you can actually call if you have any suspicions and you want to talk through them. Or you have even more than suspicions. You can call the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And there's a lot more information about those signs there too. Number two, we always emphasize contacting your local representatives, encouraging them to maintain, this is more important than ever now in our new landscape, maintaining federal funding for the TVAP program. It is a federal crime. It is a federal problem. And I think we need to ensure that we have federal responses that are significant enough to actually make a dent, which they have, as Andrew and Bart said, in the last 20 years, 25 years. Number three, all of the people that we serve need a lot of material support, recovery support, people-to-people support. But one of the tangible ways you can help is to donate. goods that we use to help people set up their life. That's furniture, it's household goods, clothing, and you can go on our website and see very specifically what we need to help survivors. And then finally, we always say the most important way to support us is to donate. This is more important than ever, as many people are aware. The federal government is shifting in its priorities around some of the support of survivors and immigrant survivors in our communities. We're going to rely much more heavily on private support than we have ever before. And in order to keep our services strong and responding to the needs of the many, many people who are caught in these experiences, we're going to need your support to help provide safety and help them really rebuild and create opportunity. I think Bart said in the beginning, we really have an opportunity to put people on a track to a really, really wonderful life, but we can only do it with support. So with that, thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to turn it over to Jeff to close us out.
Yeah, I don't have much more to say. Thank you very much to everybody for joining us this afternoon. I want to thank San and Bart and Andrew for a great presentation, an informative presentation. A lot of great questions in the chat. As Zan said, please keep your eye on this issue and the funding for it at the federal level in particular over the next several months. And we appreciate your support. This work doesn't happen without the support of folks like you. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for believing in immigrants and refugees as always, especially at this time, and for learning more about this very important program here at IINE. Thank you.